Welcome back to the Doctrine Deep Dive. Today we are plunging headfirst into a really dense and sometimes, let's be honest, quite disheartening topic. We're looking at the complex, interlocking relationship between global political development and economic development. Our mission for this deep dive. It's really about understanding why that great wave of global democratic and economic progress we saw towards the end of the 20th century seems to have bypassed a huge portion of the world, leaving about 1 billion people kind of stuck in political stagnation and, frankly, deep poverty.
That's right. And for this mission, we're going to need to synthesize some truly foundational work. It's quite a stack we have today. We're pulling insights from several powerful sources. We've got critical perspectives on what's called democratic recession from Larry Diamond. Then there's the essential framework for understanding state structures from Peter Evans. And of course, Paul Collier's really groundbreaking analysis on the challenges facing the world's poorest countries, the group he famously calls the bottom billion.
Okay, great. Let's unpack this immediately then, starting with the political side of the story, because, that narrative we were all kind of sold in the 1990s, the triumph of liberal democracy, well, it's taken a pretty significant hit. So let's call this first part the stalled tide. Back at the turn of the century, things looked so incredibly optimistic on a global scale.
Yeah.
It really did feel like an unstoppable democratic wave.
Absolutely. And the data seem to back that up. If you look from the mid-1970s onwards, it suggested a massive, almost structural shift. Since 1974, you had over 90 countries making transitions towards democracy, which meant that by around the year 2000, roughly 60% of independent states were operating under some form of democracy. And we saw major, really populous nations making these transitions, think Mexico, Indonesia, plus all the excitement around the color revolutions in places like Georgia and Ukraine. It really did suggest democracy was becoming the default future for political systems everywhere.
It felt like a tipping point had been reached, definitely. But Larry Diamond, in his work looking at democratic rollback, he offered a pretty severe reality check. He argues that all those celebrations, they were decidedly premature, because the world had, maybe quietly at first, slipped into what he terms a democratic recession. And this wasn't just a temporary dip, was it? It was more like a sustained, quite alarming decline in both the quality and the sheer quantity of global freedom.
Exactly. And what's really crucial to understand here is that this reversal wasn't just a few fragile small states collapsing. That would be bad enough. But we've seen democracy actively, sometimes violently overthrown, or maybe more insidiously, gradually stifled in major strategically important nations. You have to think about Russia's shift under Vladimir Putin, the immense political turbulence in Nigeria, the military coups in Thailand, and that deep authoritarian creep we saw in Venezuela under Chavez.
Right. And those specific, sometimes abrupt and violent setbacks, like what happened in Kenya back in December 2007, they really put a spotlight on just how fragile some of these post-transition systems actually are. I mean, Kenya had been held up as a kind of model of economic potential, hadn't it? Only to see its political fabric basically shredded almost overnight because of allegations of electoral malpractice.
That Kenya example is absolutely vital, and it connects directly to why many observers, particularly in the West, maybe missed the severity of this rollback initially. They failed perhaps to acknowledge the recession's true scope because they focused too much on the overall number of countries that still technically held the label democracy.
Wait, hold on. So you're saying the sheer volume of states doesn't matter as much. Are you suggesting that Russia's backsliding, for instance, carries more weight than, say, several smaller European states, maybe improving their democratic scores? How do we balance that?
Well, that's precisely Diamond's point. Western observers might have looked at the aggregate count and felt relatively comfortable, maybe thinking, well, okay, we lost 2 democracies here, but we gained 1 over there, or something similar. It looks okay on the surface. But they neglected the size, the population, and crucially, the political and strategic importance of the countries involved. When regional powerhouses, huge energy suppliers like Russia or Nigeria extinguish even the most basic forms of electoral democracy, whether it's through constitutional trickery, executive overreach, or just blatant electoral rigging, that loss diminishes the democratic world's collective weight in a really dramatic way. A few small gains elsewhere just don't offset the loss of democratic potential or leadership in a major nation like that.
Okay, that reframing, thinking about weight versus just the count, that's extremely powerful. It implies the democratic project isn't just about, planting flags in new places. It's about sustaining robust institutions in places that really matter on the global stage. So if we look beyond that initial promise and the sheer numbers, we move straight into this quality control problem. Let's shift our deep dive now into beyond the ballot box. This is where we really tackle Diamond's challenge to superficial democracy, or what he calls electoral authoritarianism.
Yes, and this is such a critical distinction. We absolutely cannot afford to confuse the mere structure with the actual function of democracy. For a country to be genuinely democratic, it needs so much more than just the basics, like regular multi-party elections held under a civilian constitutional order. Those things can easily become just a facade.
Right. Diamond argues that true, sustainable democracy demands genuine political freedom. That means the freedom to advocate your views, to associate with others, to actually contest power, and to campaign openly without fear of serious reprisal. But the institutional requirements go even deeper than that, don't they? It requires things like a fair and neutral electoral administration, a credible system for resolving disputes that the opposition can actually trust.
Balanced access to mass media that isn't just a mouthpiece for the ruling party, and independent, robust vote monitoring.
Absolutely.
All of those.
Yeah.
And when a country fails on these checks, when the judicial system is basically captured by the ruling elite, or when opposition parties find they can't get funding or fair media coverage, then it slips below that threshold of genuine democracy. Even if elections happen reliably every 4 or 5 years, like clockwork, these are the states that become electoral authoritarianisms. They use the process of democracy itself to legitimize what is essentially an authoritarian hold on power.
And we see this slipping happening even in nations that were traditionally counted among the democratic ranks. Diamond points to examples, I think, like Georgia, Mozambique, the Philippines, maybe even Senegal. Places where electoral contests often lack those comprehensive guarantees of fairness and freedom that are needed. The contests feel rigged, or at least heavily tilted, before the first ballot is even cast.
And this regression is actually measurable. You can see it in the data. Findings from organizations like Freedom House really confirmed the alarm bells. Their surveys around 2008, for instance, showed the ratio of countries improving their freedom scores versus those declining was the worst it had been since the fall of the Berlin Wall back in 1989. That data point really suggests a definitive negative turning point in the global political climate around that time.
Which brings us directly to the impact of bad governance. That seems to be the immediate consequence of this kind of superficial democratic structure. In many of these newer or maybe weaker democracies, the whole political phenomenon is just a facade, and it's blighted by multiple forms of malpractice. We're talking about things like abusive police forces, right?
Yeah.
Domineering local oligarchies controlling regional politics, incompetent bureaucracies that just can't deliver basic services.
Corrupt judiciaries that sell justice to the highest bidder, and maybe most damningly, these venal ruling elites who are just openly contemptuous of the rule of law. They act as if they're above it.
And the human consequence of all that. The populace becomes what Diamond calls citizens only in name. They might have the theoretical right to vote, sure, but they lack any meaningful channels for real political participation. Elections become just these contests between clientelistic parties swapping patronage deals. Parliaments fail to represent broad constituencies effectively. And even though they might have these grand constitutions on paper, the ruling class completely lacks constitutionalism, that deep internal commitment to respecting the spirit and the letter of the law, especially when it's inconvenient for them.
The resulting disillusionment creates this profound crisis of public confidence. You see it consistently in public opinion surveys. While majorities in these countries often say they support democracy in principle, they have absolutely no faith in the politicians, the parties, or the government officials. They widely believe these figures are only serving themselves and their cronies.
And when citizens feel like their vote is essentially meaningless, or that their elected officials are just exchanging one form of corruption for another, what happens? They start looking for alternatives. Alternatives that promise efficiency, maybe order, or just populist immediate action, right?
Yeah.
This seems to pave the way for the strongman figures.
Exactly. The rise of the strongman is really the political symptom of that deeper governance failure. Disenfranchised voters, just tired of corrupt stagnation, often embrace figures who promise to cut through the bureaucracy and deliver results. Often this comes at the expense of political freedom, but people are desperate. Think of Vladimir Putin consolidating power in Russia by appealing to stability and nationalism after the chaos of the 90s. Or Hugo Chavez capturing that massive populist vote in Venezuela by directly attacking the established corrupt elites and promising radical redistribution.
Yes, and observers feared similar trajectories for other populists who emerged around the same time in South America, like Evo Morales in Bolivia or Rafael Correa in Ecuador. Even in Thailand, we saw voters repeatedly backing Thaksin Shinawatra, who definitely governed with a kind of softer autocracy until the military eventually intervened. These examples seem to show a common theme. If democratic structures don't actually perform, if they fail to protect citizens' freedoms, if they don't tolerate reasonable dissent, and if they can't respond to basic needs like infrastructure, health, education, then voters will eventually choose the perceived strong hand of the autocrat over what feels like ineffective, corrupt freedom.
You've laid out that political failure very clearly, and it leads us to a really fascinating inversion of what has been the accepted wisdom for a long time, the governance imperative. We have, for decades, operated under this almost unquestioned assumption that economic growth, or maybe just implementing a free market economy, is the primary key to achieving and then consolidating democracy. It's the standard modernization theory, really, that economy first mantra.
But Diamond forcefully argues this widely accepted causal chain is basically backward. He suggests that without significant improvements first in governance, meaning the quality, the transparency, the accountability of state institutions, economic growth either won't take off in the first place, or if it does, it simply won't be sustainable.
Now, I know what you might be thinking. Isn't that a tough sell? Historically, didn't countries like, say, Taiwan or South Korea prioritize growth under authoritarian regimes first and then liberalize politically later? How does Diamond account for that specific sequence?
Yeah, that's a good point. What's the response there?
Well, it's a crucial historical challenge, and Diamond certainly acknowledges that sequence is possible. He's not denying that history. But the difference today, he argues, particularly in the most vulnerable states we're discussing, is often the absence of the kind of institutional capacity that those East Asian states possessed, even under authoritarianism. In many of the developing countries facing this current democratic recession, even pro-growth policies are rendered ineffective because the legal and political institutions just cannot perform basic functions reliably. They can't control corruption effectively, they can't punish cheating firms consistently, and they can't ensure a level playing field or reliable enforcement of contracts. You can announce market reforms until you're blue in the face, but if the customs agency steals your imported goods and the local judge takes a bribe to rule against you, well, our market just fails. The reforms are meaningless on the ground.
So political failure can actively sabotage economic success. That tragic case of Kenya we mentioned earlier seems to perfectly illustrate this inversion.
It really does. Under President Kibaki, Kenya achieved some quite remarkable economic success for a period. They were seeing 5% annual growth. They established free universal primary education. These were tangible benefits people felt. Yet, despite this economic progress, the country descended rapidly into horrific violence after the December 2007 election. Why? Because of widespread allegations of fraud, cynical tribal mobilization by elites, and this deep sense of political betrayal among large parts of the population.
Kibaki failed politically. That's the core issue. He apparently condoned massive corruption among his allies. He engaged in systematic ethnic favoritism in appointments and resource allocation. And he was seen as complicit in electoral malpractice. This poisonous mix, this erosion of the basic rules of the political game, it completely unraveled all those hard-won economic gains almost overnight. I mean, if political risk can wipe out 5 years of 5% growth in a matter of weeks, policymakers really need to radically reprioritize building political institutions over just focusing on macroeconomic stability figures.
And the deeper analytical context here, which is really key to understanding why this problem persists, is that bad governance isn't some kind of aberration that just needs fixing occasionally. Diamond suggests it's closer to a natural condition of human power structures. The inherent tendency of elites, pretty much everywhere throughout history, is to try and monopolize power and resources for themselves and their group, not to actively restrain themselves through transparent laws, strong independent institutions, and genuine market competition. So building good governance isn't a one-off task. It's an active, continuous fight against that natural gravitational pull towards corruption and rent-seeking.
That makes the institutional structure of the state itself absolutely vital, which is the perfect segue into Peter Evans's framework. When we shift to Evans, we realize that states aren't just administrative centers. They're active apparatuses that really have to be defined by how they affect development. He makes it really clear that states are not standardized commodities. They differ immensely in their nature and impact.
Exactly. His framework moves us way beyond that simplistic debate of just more state versus less state. It's much more nuanced. Instead, he provides this typology based on the state's internal structure and its external ties to society. And at the worst end of the spectrum, we find what he calls the predatory state.
Okay, the predatory state. This is defined as a state that basically extracts such massive amounts of investable surplus, essentially looting the national treasury and resources, while providing incredibly few collective goods like infrastructure or security in return. to the point where it actively impedes economic transformation. It actually becomes a net negative for its own society.
The archetypal, truly devastating case study here is Zaire, which is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, particularly under the long Mobutu Sese Seko regime starting back in 1965. Mobutu and his immediate coterie essentially treated the entire country like their own personal ATM machine. It's almost unbelievable. They extracted vast personal fortunes from the country's
And what was the long-term consequence for the people of Zaire? Just devastating, right?
utterly devastating. The gross national product per capita actually declined at an annual rate of about 2.1% for the first 2 decades of Mobutu's rule. It pushed the country towards the very bottom of the global economic hierarchy. The political class became entirely preoccupied with rent-seeking, finding ways to extract wealth without producing anything. And this turned the rest of society, especially any potential entrepreneurs or just honest citizens trying to make a living, into their prey.
So that political environment under Mobutu, characterized by extreme personalism, blatant plunder, it essentially destroyed the very possibility of long-term profit-based productive investment, didn't it? I mean, why would anyone build a factory if Mobutu's family or cronies could simply seize it the next day with no recourse?
Precisely. Mobutu himself was famously quoted as saying, "Everything is for sale, everything is bought in our country." That was the reality. This systematic plundering right from the very top destroyed any hope of rule-governed behavior filtering down into the lower bureaucracy. The entire state apparatus was effectively marketized for immediate personal gain, which meant genuine development was just an impossibility because the basic rules needed for a market like secure property rights, reliable contract enforcement, simply didn't exist. They were actively undermined.
Okay, now, in stark contrast to that incredibly destructive model, Evans introduces the idea of the effective state, the developmental state, and he argues its efficacy depends on two key elements, one internal and one external.
That's right. The internal structure, he argues, must adhere pretty closely to the Weberian ideal of bureaucracy. That means it needs a highly developed meritocratic bureaucracy. People are hired and promoted based on skill, not connections. This bureaucracy must possess a strong sense of corporate identity, a shared mission, and really critically, what he calls corporate coherence.
Okay, define corporate coherence for us a bit more. How does a bureaucracy achieve that kind of insulation or unity?
Corporate coherence means the bureaucracy is internally unified. It has a professional identity and ethos strong enough to resist immediate, particularistic demands coming from society. It ensures that the individual incumbents, the actual bureaucrats doing the work, are insulated from pressure from powerful private interests who might be seeking special favors, tax breaks, or exemptions from regulations. This is the autonomy part of Evans's successful model. The civil service needs to be paid well, trained rigorously, promoted predictably, and operate according to universalistic rules, not personal whims. This insulates it, to a degree, from the corrupt transactional politics swirling around it.
But as you pointed out, autonomy alone isn't enough, is it? Especially not if you want to foster economic transformation in late developing countries. It really needs strategic guidance. That's where the external ties come in, what Evans calls embeddedness.
Absolutely. The state cannot successfully guide development locked away in an ivory tower. It needs to be connected. It must also have a dense set of institutionalized links to private elites, the key players in the economy. These ties are necessary because the state needs good market intelligence. It needs information. It needs to know which industrial sectors might be viable, where the crucial bottlenecks are in the economy, and how to actually implement a cohesive national project of capital accumulation. This embeddedness allows for strategic state intervention without succumbing to capture or predation by those private interests. It's a very delicate balance.
So the most effective states, according to Evans, managed to achieve what he calls embedded autonomy. They successfully managed to join that well-developed, insulated, bureaucratic internal organization with these dense institutionalized public-private ties. Where do we see the synthesis work best in practice?
Well, the clearest historical successes were undoubtedly the East Asian miracles, specifically countries like Japan and South Korea during their periods of rapid industrialization post-World War II. They really followed the path suggested by economic historians like Alexander Gerschenkron and Alberto Hirschman. This involved strategic state intervention, guided by these embedded elite networks, which actively fostered capital accumulation while simultaneously enforcing accountability on the private firms receiving support. You got state help, but you had to perform.
That model's success is pretty undeniable historically. But Evans also notes that embedded autonomy itself creates its own challenges over time, doesn't it? The very success of that framework eventually starts to change the relationship between capital and the state.
It absolutely does. As the private sector matures and becomes globally competitive, private capital naturally becomes less dependent on the state's resources and its strategic guidance. The state's relative dominance inevitably diminishes. Furthermore, economic growth almost always brings a resurgence of distributional demands from organized labor, perhaps, or from newly powerful regional elites who weren't part of the original bargain. And the original, tightly knit elite networks often weren't designed to handle this increased pluralism and conflict over resources. So it's a structure that can, in a way, sow the seeds of its own transformation as the economy matures and society demands more open political participation.
Okay, let's pivot back for a moment to that initial skepticism regarding the state's role, particularly that neo-utilitarian school of thought. The one that often argues state action itself is the principal impediment to development, which then leads to calls to just shrink the state or minimize the state across the board.
Yes, and Evans offers a profoundly important, much more nuanced contradiction to that overly simplistic view. Now, he does concede that shrinking the scope of state initiatives might be necessary in certain intermediate cases, maybe like Brazil was at the time he was writing, where state capacity is genuinely limited. A weak state probably should avoid attempting extremely complex tasks, like trying to build advanced jet engines from scratch if it's clearly beyond its capabilities. That's just about strategic selectivity. Choose your battles.
But the idea of minimizing the resources allocated to the bureaucracy itself, to minimize the state mantra, in his view, that's dangerously counterproductive and incredibly short-sighted.
Right. Oh, absolutely. He sees it as potentially the worst possible outcome. If we start from the assumption that the bureaucratic apparatus is just generically predatory and corrupt, and our response is simply to eviscerate its budget, cut real wages for civil servants, eliminate training resources, reduce staffing levels, we actually lose the chance to ever build a real functioning Weberian bureaucratic apparatus. Instead, we risk solidifying the existence of a pseudo-bureaucratic or purely patrimonial system, one based on personal connections and loyalty, not rules and merit.
So you're saying that starving the bureaucracy of resources can actually accelerate the slide into predation. That seems counterintuitive to some. Yeah.
Precisely. Because those cuts inevitably undermine any existing islands of efficiency, those pockets of competent, rule-abiding bureaucrats who might still exist within the system, they get demoralized or leave. Worse yet, severe cuts can push even competent individuals who remain in the bureaucracy towards becoming predators, simply to maintain a basic living standard that's commensurate with their education and training. When official salaries drop below subsistence levels, a public official might feel they have little choice but to engage in rent-seeking just to survive and feed their family. So those neo-utilitarian prescriptions, which are intended to foster market discipline by weakening the state, can perversely lead to the creation of even more predatory states by undercutting the very capacity needed to enforce the rule of law and make the market function in the first place.
Wow. So the construction of a meritocratic, reasonably well-resourced civil service isn't some kind of luxury you add on later. It's actually a crucial developmental task right from the start. If you want a state that has the necessary autonomy and capacity to enforce the rules of the market fairly, you actually have to invest quite heavily in building that state capacity.
Exactly. And that leads us perfectly to thinking about the consequences when these political and institutional failures persist, especially for the world's most vulnerable populations. Which brings us now to Paul Collier's work. His focus is intensely on those groups who have been tragically left behind by recent global progress.
The bottom billion. Can you set the context for us? What is this massive divergence Collier identifies?
So the bottom billion refers to those countries, often numbering around 50 or so at the time he was writing, where approximately 1 billion people live. And the defining characteristic is that they are stuck in prolonged poverty, and critically, they're diverging rapidly from the rest of the developing world. That's the middle 4 billion people living in countries like China, India, Vietnam, Brazil, which have seen rapid, often accelerating economic growth in recent decades.
So it's a real dual reality of modern globalization then. Globalization has provided these incredible ladders for most societies to climb out of poverty, but as Collier argues, it has also inadvertently created these chutes for this unlucky minority. While giants like China and India managed to break free just in time to penetrate global markets for manufactured goods, this group of about 50 countries basically missed the boat.
And now they find themselves trapped, often with incomes that are actually falling further and further behind the global average.
The contrast is pretty stark, isn't it?
It's incredibly stark. Collier points out that the average person living in one of these bottom billion societies has an income only around one-fifth, just 20%, that of the typical person in the other developing countries, let alone the rich world. And if this divergence continues unchecked, the world quickly starts to accumulate into two dramatically different economic zones. You have the prosperous, globally integrated majority, and then this impoverished, often politically volatile developmental ghetto of about 1 billion people.
Collier identifies four critical traps that he argues keep these countries stuck, and they often intersect and reinforce one another, making escape incredibly difficult. Let's take a deep dive into the specifics of those traps now, starting with perhaps the most immediately destructive one, the conflict trap.
Yes, and the statistics here are just horrifying. He found that 73%, nearly three-quarters of the people living in these bottom billion societies, had recently been through, or were currently still in, a civil war. Low initial income and slow economic growth are identified as major structural factors that significantly increase the risk. Essentially, poverty and stagnation double the risk of civil war breaking out. Poverty acts like the tinder, even if specific grievances are the spark.
And the economic cost of this instability is just astronomical, isn't it? Which helps explain why they can almost never save or invest their way out of poverty while conflict persists.
Absolutely. Collier estimates that a typical civil war cost the country involved around $64 billion. Now, that sum is often equivalent to several years of that country's entire gross domestic product. It's a catastrophic economic hit. And crucially, the risk becomes self-perpetuating. Having had one civil war roughly doubles the risk of a subsequent conflict breaking out. Only about half of countries manage to make it through a full decade after a peace deal without relapsing back into violence. It's a vicious cycle.
What's the underlying mechanism, according to Collier, that makes poverty translate into conflict so reliably? It's not just about grievance, is it?
No, he provides a rather grimly economic logic for it. Hopeless poverty makes young men who are the key recruits for rebel armies very cheap to employ. Life itself is cheap, prospects are bleak. Joining a rebellion offers at least a small chance of riches if you win, or maybe just a stable income stream through looting or controlling resources. He draws a parallel to young men joining drug gangs in major Western cities. It's often an economic calculation born of desperation. And crucially, rebels often need access to resources, whether it's controlling diamond mines, timber, oil, or getting donations from diaspora communities abroad, much more than they need a genuinely justified political cause.
So that means we have to be somewhat skeptical, perhaps, of the narratives of grievance that rebel groups always put forward.
Absolutely. Rebels must generate a narrative of grievance to attract popular support and international legitimacy. That's Politics 101. But the statistical evidence Collier presents suggests that the standard underlying political or economic grievances, things like repression of political rights or measurable economic discrimination against a certain group, are surprisingly weak predictors of when civil war actually breaks out compared to the brute factors of low income, slow growth, and dependence on primary commodity exports. Often the primary goal appears to be rent extraction, seizing control of resources, rather than achieving justice for the population.
The example of Foday Sanko and the RUF in Sierra Leone seems like a really chilling illustration of that primacy of resource-seeking over political goals.
It's a textbook case. Sanko's RUF rebellion was incredibly brutal. They were notorious for recruiting child soldiers, often using drugs, and employing horrific terror tactics like amputation, primarily to seize control of Sierra Leone's diamond-rich areas. And when Sanko was eventually offered a very generous peace settlement, which included the post of vice president and amnesty, he initially refused it. Why? Because his clear primary goal wasn't achieving political justice for the people of Sierra Leone, it was securing permanent personal control over those lucrative diamond concessions. That's the resource-seeking mechanism in its purest, ugliest form.
Okay, moving on to the second trap, which is often deeply intertwined with conflict, the natural resource trap. This is the counterintuitive finding that significant resource wealth, having lots of oil or diamonds or other valuable commodities, frequently ends up producing long-term economic growth, contrary to what common sense might expect. You'd think it would be a massive advantage.
Exactly, and this failure seems to stem from a combination of both economic and political mechanisms. On the economic side, we encounter the phenomenon often known as Dutch disease. When a country starts exporting a major natural resource in large quantities, foreign currency floods into the country. This causes the local currency to appreciate quite rapidly.
And remind us why that currency appreciation is bad for long-term development.
Because it makes everything else the country produces, especially potentially competitive manufactured goods or agricultural exports, suddenly much more expensive on the global market. They become uncompetitive overnight. So it actively inhibits that crucial process of economic diversification, particularly into manufacturing, which has historically been the most reliable path to achieving high income status for countries. The country becomes almost wholly reliant on the fluctuating price of that single commodity, making its entire economic structure dangerously fragile and vulnerable to price shocks.
Okay, that's the economic side. Now, on the political side, how does having all this resource wealth actively make democracy, in particular, malfunction?
Well, those volatile export revenues often lead government officials to spend incredibly irresponsibly during the boom times. They initiate wasteful, often corrupt, white elephant projects that aren't sustainable, only to face devastating fiscal crises and spending cuts when the inevitable commodity price crash happens. But crucially, Collier argues that resource rents make democracies in particular malfunction because they fuel the politics of patronage. Electoral competition stops being about holding the government accountable for efficiently delivering public services like schools or hospitals, and instead becomes primarily about the exchange of goods, jobs, and favors for political support, essentially, buying votes with resource money.
Right, because the government has access to this massive stream of unearned income money that doesn't come from taxing the citizens. It erodes those critical checks and balances between the state and society. We saw that so vividly in Nigeria during the big oil boom years, didn't we? Where corruption became almost the central organizing principle of political life.
Absolutely. The key finding here from Collier is that without really robust political restraints, things like a truly independent judiciary, a functioning parliament that can actually scrutinize the budget, a free and critical press, natural resource wealth actively harms long-term growth, especially in countries that have intense electoral competition but weak institutions. The resource essentially acts as a gigantic slush fund for the ruling party to use to bypass accountability mechanisms and entrench itself in power. The rare success story often cited is Botswana, which managed to maintain remarkably strong political restraints and fiscal discipline despite its huge diamond wealth. They enforced strong budgetary rules and accumulated surplus funds abroad. That political restraint seems to have been the key differentiator.
Okay, the third trap is a geographic one. Landlocked with bad neighbors. Being resource scarce and landlocked is identified as a really severe impediment, affecting about 30% of Africa's population.
Yes, landlocked countries depend critically on their neighbors for two key things. For economic growth spillovers, hoping their neighbors' prosperity will pull them along, and perhaps even more importantly, for physical access to the coast and thus to global markets. Globally, landlocked countries typically benefit significantly from their neighbors' growth. They use them as key export markets and crucial trade routes. But what happens if those neighbors themselves are stuck in conflict or suffering from really bad governance?
Then the landlocked country is trapped too. It can't get its goods out easily, and there's no positive economic energy spilling over from next door.
Precisely. Think about a country like Uganda. It's landlocked, it's relatively resource scarce, and look at its neighbors. Kenya, which has been prone to political violence, South Sudan, still deeply unstable, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, vast but plagued by conflict, Somalia, a failed state for decades, Rwanda, still dealing with post-genocide issues, Tanzania, more stable but still poor. Uganda can neither access the global market cheaply and reliably through its neighbors, nor can it rely on them for stable growth spillovers to boost its own economy.
It creates this really crippling dependency where the fate of one country is almost held hostage by the failures or successes of the countries surrounding it.
And Collier notes something striking in the data. For Africa's landlocked countries, the statistical spillover effect from neighbor growth is virtually nil. It just doesn't seem to happen there, unlike in other regions. This suggests either their transport infrastructure isn't geared towards regional integration effectively, or perhaps they are just surrounded by such persistently poor economic performance that there's precious little positive growth to spill over in the first place. He mentions this really sobering anecdote about the horizon of ambition for a country like the Central African Republic, another landlocked nation. At one point, their main goal was merely to reach the economic level of poor Burkina Faso within 20 years, because even that seemed like the best-case scenario given its neighborhood.
Wow. Okay, finally, the fourth trap. Bad governance in a small country. Collier finds that 76%, over three-quarters of the bottom billion countries, suffer from persistently bad governance and poor policymaking. And as we established earlier when discussing Diamond, bad governance can destroy an economy with alarming speed and totality.
Yes, and this trap highlights a really critical asymmetry that's worth emphasizing. Good governance certainly helps a country realize whatever opportunities it might have. But good governance alone cannot defy gravity. It can't magically generate opportunities where none fundamentally exist, like overcoming being landlocked with bad neighbors. Conversely, however, poor governance absolutely can ruin even the most promising economic prospects. Bad policy and corruption can snatch defeat from the jaws of victory.
And the size of the economy and the level of alternative opportunities available seem to matter a lot when you're measuring the real impact of corruption and bad policy. Let's look at that comparison Collier draws between Chad and Bangladesh.
It's a very revealing comparison. In Chad, which is landlocked, oil-dependent, and has very weak institutions, government services are virtually the only option available to most of the populace for crucial things like healthcare and education. There aren't many private alternatives, so when a survey tracked funds intended for rural health clinics in Chad, it found that less than 1% of the money released by the Ministry of Finance actually reached the clinics on the ground. 99% vanished into the pockets of officials along the way. Bad governance matters profoundly there because it essentially closes off the single available path to basic development for most people.
But in contrast, Bangladesh, which at the time Collier was writing, actually tied with Chad for the bottom place in Transparency International's global corruption ratings, somehow managed to achieve pretty decent economic growth. Why the difference? If both were perceived as highly corrupt.
The key difference, Collier argues, was that Bangladesh's economy had other opportunities and options, largely thanks to its dynamic, ready-made garment export sector. And it also had a vibrant ecosystem of non-governmental organizations and civil society groups, which often operated outside or in parallel to the heavily corrupt government sector, providing alternative services. So, for the average Bangladeshi, bad government policy and corruption were undoubtedly a huge drag on progress, but they weren't necessarily a total development killer because other economic avenues existed. For the average Chadian, however, the government was literally the only game in town for many essential services. And when that government is predatory or just hopelessly ineffective, the whole country sinks.
Okay, so we've established this picture of political decline intertwined with deep economic stagnation, all caught in these reinforcing traps. This brings us to the crucial, really practical question. How on earth do we break these interlocking traps? Let's move into section 5 of our deep dive, instruments for structural change. Start us off maybe by discussing how globalization itself, ironically, has become a bit of an obstacle for these latecomers, forcing us to rethink our traditional strategies.
Yes, the difficulty, as Collier really emphasizes, is that these countries have fundamentally missed the boat in a crucial sense. Even countries that have recently managed to escape some of their internal traps, maybe stabilizing after conflict, like Madagascar and Mozambique did for a while, they now face a global market that is far more hostile to new entrants in manufacturing than it was back in, say, the 1980s when the Asian tigers were taking off. Why? Because giants like China, India, Vietnam have already established enormous scale economies and highly competitive production networks, making entry for small, late developing countries extremely challenging.
And it's worse than just struggling to compete. These bottom billion countries don't typically integrate into the global economy through productive capital inflows, which is what you need to spur growth. Instead, they often integrate through capital flight. Is that right?
That's exactly right. Both domestic investors and potential foreign investors perceive the enormous risks, the political instability, the poor policies, the potential for conflict relapse, and this drives capital out of the region. This includes both corruptly acquired money being laundered abroad and also legitimately earned savings that people simply don't feel safe investing locally. It all flows out, often into Western banks or real estate.
The statistics on that are pretty damning, aren't they?
They really are. Collier cited data showing that, at one point, Africans held a greater proportion of their total private wealth abroad than any other region in the world, even including the oil-rich Middle East. Think about that. The most capital-scarce region on Earth was actively exporting its own capital because local investment opportunities were judged to be too poor or too risky, largely due to the traps themselves. And this high perceived risk gets reflected and then reinforced by things like financial risk ratings from agencies like Institutional Investor. Even when brave internal reformers take over and enact really necessary, difficult changes, as happened in Uganda under Museveni initially, investor perception often takes years, literally years, to catch up and reflect that turnaround. This delay hinders the real inflows of capital needed to sustain the reforms. The negative reputation sticks.
And we also cannot ignore the complicating factor of the China effect in recent years. China has been aggressively pursuing natural resources in many of these countries, often, it seems, without much concern for governance standards or transparency.
Yes, this poses a major structural obstacle to promoting reform in resource-rich, fragile states. China often offers large loans, infrastructure deals, or resource-backed credit lines to governments in countries like Angola, Sudan, or even Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe. And these deals effectively let those governments off the hook from the pressure that Western countries and institutions like the World Bank or International Monetary Fund might be trying to exert to clean up the misuse of resource money or improve fiscal transparency. When the West says, we'll give you aid, but you need to publish your oil contracts, China might just offer a big loan with no questions asked, directly undermining the leverage for essential reforms and potentially reinforcing the natural resource trap.
Okay, so it's abundantly clear that the solution here requires much more than just throwing money at the problem.
Yeah.
You highlighted earlier that aid alone, even if it were dramatically doubled as sometimes pledged, is insufficient. And historically, it's often served merely as a kind of holding operation, preventing total collapse perhaps, but not really acting as a catalyst for sustainable growth or structural change.
Yeah. That's the core argument. Real structural change, Collier insists, requires the coordinated, intelligent use of all four major policy instruments available to the developed world. Aid, yes, but also security interventions, laws and charters, both domestic and international, and trade policy. We need to move away from the traditional model where development is siloed within aid agencies and start thinking about how to integrate these powerful policy tools in a complementary way, focused specifically on breaking those traps.
Okay, let's look at the power of those charters and laws first, starting with cleaning up our own jurisdictions in the developed world. Because, as Collier points out, Western banks have often acted as safe havens for money looted from these very countries. We saw infamous examples like the massive cash deposits made by Nigerian dictator Sani Abacha's family in Swiss and London banks, or the Riggs Bank scandal involving huge sums from Equatorial Guinea's ruling family.
Exactly. Western taxpayers and consumers are, in effect, unknowingly subsidizing global corruption by allowing these stolen funds to be housed safely and easily within our own financial institutions. To counter this, Collier argues we need radically easier legal mechanisms for freezing and repatriating corrupt deposits found in our banks. He makes the point that if this were perceived primarily as a high-priority terrorism financing issue, the political will and legal changes would likely materialize very quickly. But because it's only about governance and development in the bottom billion, the legal hurdles for seizing and returning stolen assets remain extraordinarily, often prohibitively high for the poor countries trying to recover them. We need to lower those hurdles dramatically and make the reputational and financial cost of handling stolen money much higher for the banks involved.
Okay, that's about stemming the outflow. What about managing the inflow, particularly for resource revenues? That leads to the second key instrument in this category, the idea of a charter for natural resource revenues. This seems crucial because, as you said, resource revenues flowing into the bottom billion are often larger than aid flows, but they are far more poorly used, often fueling conflict and corruption instead of development.
Precisely. This charter, Collier suggests, should demand transparency and good practice throughout the entire resource extraction chain, covering at least four essential points. First, transparent contracting. Resource exploration and extraction rights, those incredibly valuable concessions for oil fields or mines, must be auctioned off in a genuinely transparent, competitive process. No more secret backroom deals. This aims to eliminate the common practice where corrupt companies bribe government ministers for sweetheart deals on lucrative concessions, which is often the very starting point for systemic resource corruption.
Makes sense. What's the second demand of this proposed charter?
Second, price risk sharing. He argues that the sophisticated international resource companies, who are much better equipped to handle commodity price volatility, should bear at least part of the price risk. So instead of government revenues swinging wildly between boom and bust, destroying budget planning, the actual revenue stream the governments receive would be smoothed out somewhat by the companies hedging or using other financial instruments. This would allow for much better, more stable, long-term public investment planning.
Okay. Third, building on existing initiatives like the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, EPI, transparency of payments.
Yes. All payments made by resource companies to the government must be publicly disclosed and easily accessible. Critically, this transparency must also be extended to include the activities of national oil companies, NOCs. These NOCs in many countries often act like opaque governments within governments, controlling vast sums of money with virtually zero public accountability or parliamentary oversight. Their books need to be opened.
And finally, the fourth point.
Finally, rules for smoothing volatile public spending. Even with smoother revenues, governments must be obligated, perhaps through constitutional rules or internationally monitored agreements, to save a significant portion of resource revenues during boom periods, perhaps in offshore funds like Norway does. And they should only be allowed to spend from a smooth budget amount based on long-term expected revenue. This prevents those disastrous boom and bust spending cycles. Collier uses the example of East Timor, a new nation blessed with oil. They made the wise decision early on to consult Norway on how to manage their oil wealth responsibly, rather than, say, taking the model of Angola, which was plagued by corruption. This shows the urgent need for a clear, clean, internationally endorsed model charter that reformers within these countries can point to and use to lock in good fiscal behavior, giving them leverage against internal pressure from corrupt colleagues who just want to spend the money now.
And alongside managing resource revenue, we also need a similar charter for budget transparency on the spending side, right? How governments actually spend the money they receive, whether from resources, taxes, or aid, is often just as important as how they earn it.
Absolutely. This charter needs to implement scrutiny from two directions simultaneously, from the bottom up and sideways. That Uganda example Collier highlights is really the gold standard for bottom-up scrutiny. When the Ugandan Ministry of Finance started simply publishing the details of budget releases meant for primary schools in local newspapers and on community notice boards, the proportion of non-salary funds that actually reached the schools reportedly jumped from a miserable 20% to around 90% within just a few years. Why? Because the local headmaster, the parents, the community now knew exactly how much money their school was supposed to receive. They could hold local officials accountable. Combine that with sideways scrutiny, where local governments or districts can compare their performance and funding levels with their peers, and you create powerful incentives for honesty and efficiency that are often far more effective than any top-down centralized auditing system, which can also be prone to corruption.
Okay, switching gears now to the selective use of security and trade. These two policy instruments that are often kept quite separate from traditional development aid thinking. Let's start with security, which often feels like the most politically sensitive and fraught area for external intervention.
It is sensitive, absolutely, but Collier argues that security interventions, when used strategically, can be vital. They must be tactical and targeted, primarily focused on stabilizing fragile regimes against internal collapse or overthrow, particularly coup d'etat. He suggests that providing credible external military guarantees against coups, particularly in countries identified as having a high risk of them, can halt what he terms grand extortion.
Okay, let's detail that mechanism of grand extortion. How exactly does that operate on the ground?
Well, in these high-risk countries, the existing government, often feeling insecure and desperate to survive, ends up paying huge amounts of money to its own army simply to prevent being overthrown. They end up spending far more on the military as a share of their budget than richer, more stable countries do, and much of that money goes not on genuine defense needs, but on loyalty payments, patronage, and keeping senior officers happy to maintain the regime's survival. The tragic consequence is that aid money, which is supposed to be funding schools and clinics and roads, often gets diverted, directly or indirectly, to maintain this incredibly expensive internal protection racket. Credible external military guarantees, essentially, a clear promise from regional powers or the international community that they will intervene to restore a legitimate government if it's overthrown by a coup, can break this extortion cycle. It makes coups less likely to succeed and therefore allows the government to feel more secure and potentially redirect that spending from military patronage towards actual development priorities.
The British intervention in Sierra Leone back in 2000 is often cited as a potential model here, isn't it? Stabilizing the fragile post-conflict state relatively quickly and at a surprisingly low cost, arguably providing a foundation of security that aid alone could never have achieved.
Exactly. It demonstrated that sometimes a relatively small, well-timed security intervention can provide the necessary political stabilization for development efforts to actually take root.
Okay, finally, let's turn to trade policy for diversification. You argue, based on Collier, that the traditional solution, often proposed things like fair trade initiatives, is probably insufficient for the scale of the challenge facing the bottom billion. They need something much more radical and specifically tailored to their unique competitive constraints.
That's the core idea. The bottom line is that most countries in the bottom billion simply cannot compete head-on with established Asian manufacturers in the global market right now. They missed that critical early window. They desperately need to get onto the manufacturing productivity escalator learning by doing, improving quality, moving up the value chain. But the first step onto that escalator is currently just too steep because of intense global competition. So to achieve this, Collier argues they need temporary, non-reciprocal protections, specifically from Asian competition, but crucially, only within the rich world markets, North America, Europe, Japan.
Okay, explain that. What does temporary non-reciprocal protection actually look like in practice?
It essentially means granting manufactured goods coming from these specific bottom billion countries preferential access to rich world markets. They would be allowed to pay zero tariffs or significantly lower tariffs for their products compared to similar goods coming from dominant, highly competitive exporters like China or India or Vietnam. It's explicitly designed as an expedient pump priming strategy. Collier calls it a gift, not a deal. It's not about negotiating reciprocal concessions. The goal is to allow their nascent manufacturing sectors, maybe textiles, simple electronics assembly, agricultural processing, to gain a crucial foothold, learn the ropes, build scale, without facing the absolutely suffocating competition they face today from established Asian giants in those key export markets.
And existing schemes like the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA in the United States, or the Everything But Arms, EBA scheme in the European Union, haven't really delivered this effectively.
Largely, no. Collier argues they were often overly complicated, with complex rules of origin designed mainly to appease domestic lobbies in the West. They were often too narrowly focused on specific products or didn't include all the countries most likely to actually benefit or break into manufacturing. They weren't targeted enough on that core competitive problem versus Asia. What's needed, he argues, is really simplified, generous, time-limited access, perhaps guaranteeing a specific market niche for a decade or so, specifically designed to allow these latecomers a genuine chance to move on to that productivity escalator, diversify their economies away from those volatile natural resources, and finally start escaping the traps that hold them back.
Okay, wow. We have covered a massive amount of ground today. From the rollback of democracy globally and the nature of predatory versus developmental states, through to the specific economic traps Collier identifies, and finally outlining these 4 broad policy instruments required for coordinated structural change. Let's try to move towards our conclusion now and tie these really profound threads together.
I think the central theme that emerges from weaving Diamond, Evans, and Collier together is crystal clear, isn't it? The long-term viability of democracy globally and the success of economic development for the poorest depend critically on the actual performance of those at-risk democracies, the ones plagued by poor governance. These countries are fighting against incredibly deep interlocking traps, conflict traps, resource traps, the trap of bad geography, and the trap of disastrous policy inertia fueled by bad governance.
And effective change isn't going to come just from within or just from external aid alone. It seems to require this coordinated, comprehensive external support strategy that deliberately empowers the internal reformers, the heroes, as Collier sometimes calls them, who are often fighting against entrenched villains within their own systems who benefit massively from the corrupt status quo. We really have to move away from those simplistic, often polarized images of development. Either all aid just feeds corruption or just throw more money at the problem.
Right. Towards a much more targeted multi-instrument strategy that consciously uses laws, security guarantees, and specific trade policies to create the enabling environment for positive internal political and economic change to actually take hold and become sustainable.
We have to get deadly serious about the cost of inaction.
Precisely. And that leads us directly to our final provocative thought for you to consider. What is the measurable cost, the economic cost, of just letting a single one of these states fail?
Collier provides an estimate for that, doesn't he?
He does. He estimates that the total economic cost of a single failing state over its entire history of failure, considering the cost to itself, the cost to its neighbors through things like conflict spillover, refugees, and disease transmission, and the cost to the wider international community through instability and intervention, is somewhere around $100 billion. And that's probably a lower bound estimate of what a sustained, successful turnaround in just one of these countries is actually worth purely in economic terms.
Okay, now contrast that staggering figure, $100 billion cost per failure, with the political reality of how intervention costs are sometimes viewed when strategic interests are perceived to be directly at stake. The U.S.-led military intervention in Iraq, whatever you think of its justification or outcomes, provides a kind of grim benchmark. It gives us a measure of what at least one key international actor valued the perceived benefits of a state turnaround to be worth. And the direct financial costs for that intervention alone soared well past $350 billion, and the true costs are likely far higher.
So here's the final question to leave you with. If rich countries demonstrate they can value a single, potentially successful state turnaround so highly, hundreds of billions of dollars, when it's tied directly to their immediate security interests or control over vital resources like oil, then what is the real moral and long-term strategic cost of allowing potentially 50 or more at-risk democracies to just fail slowly, sliding further into that economic ghetto we discussed? The risk that this current democratic recession could deepen into a kind of global democratic depression would be enormously costly, not just to human freedom and potential in those countries, but creating massive security risks, uncontrollable refugee flows, and profound global instability that will inevitably affect us all. We know, or we should know, that the likely price of long-term neglect is orders of magnitude higher than the targeted, intelligent investment required for coordinated action using all the tools we have. That ultimately is the challenge for all of us to consider as we move forward.